In factories across America, young women sat at workbenches with tiny brushes, painting numbers that glowed in the dark. The radium. Luminous Materials Corporation and the United States Radium Corporation hired hundreds of these painters to coat watch dials and instrument panels with radium paint. The work seemed clean, respectable, and well-paying. Women earned 1.5 cents per dial, and skilled painters could complete 250 dials per day, making more money than most factory workers of their time. The technique required precision. Supervisors instructed the women to point their brushes by putting the tips between their lips, creating the finest possible point for detailed work. Lip, dip, paint became the rhythm of their days. They would lick the brush, dip it in the radium paint, apply it to the dial, and repeat. Some painters shaped their fingernails into points and used them to paint the tiniest details on clock faces. The radium made their hair, clothes, and skin glow softly in the dark. They called themselves ghost girls and thought it was magical. What these women didn't know was that radium was slowly destroying their bodies from the inside. The radioactive paint contained radium-226, which their bodies absorbed and stored in their bones, mistaking it for calcium. Every time they pointed their brushes with their lips, they swallowed microscopic amounts of the deadly element. Every time they painted their nails for fun or smoothed the paint with their fingers, they absorbed more radiation. The first sign of trouble appeared in their mouths. Their teeth began falling out. Their gums became infected and refused to heal. Dentists called it radium jaw, a condition where the jawbone itself began to deteriorate. Some women's jaws literally crumbled away, leaving gaping holes in their faces that never stopped bleeding. The radium had made their bones so radioactive that X-rays would develop simply by being placed near the affected women. Grace Fryer was one of the first to speak out. By 1925, her teeth had fallen out, her jawbone was disintegrating, and her body was riddled with tumors. She could barely walk. When she tried to sue United States Radium Corporation, she discovered that the company had known about radium's dangers for years. Internal company documents showed executives warning each other never to handle radium directly, while simultaneously telling their female workers it was perfectly safe. The women were dying in agony. Some developed severe anemia as the radium destroyed their bone marrow. Others suffered from bone cancer that ate holes through their spines and limbs. Marguerite Carlo's jaw was surgically removed, leaving her unable to speak properly. Sarah Mayer's bones became so brittle that her back broke when she stood up from a chair. These women were literally glowing with radioactivity, and their bodies were disintegrating piece by piece. The company's response was denial and victim blaming. They claimed the women were suffering from syphilis, not radium poisoning, attempting to destroy their reputations. Corporate lawyers argued that the women were promiscuous and diseased, not poisoned by their employers. Meanwhile, company executives used lead aprons and tongs when handling radium, fully aware of its lethal effects. The legal battle lasted years. Many of the radium girls died before seeing justice. When they finally won a settlement in 1928, it was too late for most of them. The case established important precedents for workers' rights and industrial safety, but the women paid with their lives for changes that came too late to save them. The neon signs outside dance halls promised beautiful girls and dancing partners, but inside, young women sold companionship by the minute to men desperate for human contact. These taxi dancers, as they were called, worked for 10 cents per dance at establishments across Depression-era America. A typical song lasted 3 to 4 minutes, meaning these women had to charm, entertain, and physically endure dozens of strangers each night just to earn enough for basic survival. The system was simple and brutal. Men purchased tickets at the door, then handed them to women for individual dances. The women received half the ticket price, with the dance hall keeping the rest. A successful taxi dancer might collect 50 to 100 tickets per night, earning between $2.50 and $5 for hours of continuous physical exertion. The money was better than most jobs available to women, but the cost was measured in bruised feet, aching backs, and constant sexual harassment. These women danced with anyone who had a ticket, drunks who could barely stand, aggressive men who groped them during slow songs, lonely souls who sobbed against their shoulders, men who reeked of alcohol, sweat, and desperation. The women had to smile through it all because their survival depended on keeping customers happy enough to buy more dances. Refusing a customer meant losing income they couldn't afford to lose. The physical toll was relentless. Taxi dancers worked 6 nights a week, often from 8 p.m. until 2 a.m. They wore thin dance shoes that provided no support, dancing on hard floors until their feet bled inside their shoes. Many developed chronic back problems from supporting drunk partners who could barely stand. The constant physical contact with unwashed men meant they were exposed to every disease and infection their customers carried. Sexual harassment wasn't just common, it was expected. Men grabbed at the women's bodies, whispered obscene proposals, and pressured them for after-hours meetings. The dancers had to navigate these advances carefully. Too much resistance might anger a customer and cost them money. Too little resistance might encourage dangerous behavior. Many women developed elaborate techniques for deflecting unwanted advances while keeping customers engaged enough to buy more tickets. The emotional labor was as exhausting as the physical demands. These women were paid to be charming, interested, and available to men who were often drunk, angry, or deeply troubled. They listened to stories of unemployment, family problems, and personal failures while pretending to care about strangers they would never see again. The work required constant performance of femininity and availability, even when they felt sick, tired, or heartbroken themselves. Society viewed taxi dancers as barely respectable, if respectable at all. Newspapers wrote about them as fallen women, and respectable families warned their daughters against such work. Yet these same critics ignored the economic reality that forced women into dance halls. With unemployment soaring and women earning half of men's wages when they could find work at all, taxi dancing offered one of the few ways for single women to earn enough money to survive independently. The women who worked as taxi dancers knew the social cost of their choice. They faced judgment from families, churches, and communities that saw their work as immoral while ignoring the economic desperation that drove them to dance halls. Many used false names and told neighbors they worked in factories or shops, hiding the reality of how they actually earned their survival during the darkest economic period in American history. The Bryant and Maymatch factory in London employed thousands of women who spent their days dipping wooden splints into vats of white phosphorus paste. The work paid better than most jobs available to working-class women, and the company advertised itself as a progressive employer that hired females for skilled manufacturing work. What they didn't advertise was that white phosphorus was slowly eating away at their workers' faces. The manufacturing process seemed straightforward enough. Women stood at long tables, taking bundles of wooden matchsticks and dipping them into heated tanks containing white phosphorus, mixed with glue and other chemicals. The phosphorus made the matches light easily when struck, creating the reliable ignition that made Bryant and May matches popular across Europe and America. The women worked quickly, dipping hundreds of matches per hour to meet production quotas that determined their daily wages. The first sign of trouble was a toothache that wouldn't go away. Then the tooth would become loose and fall out. The gum, where the tooth had been, would refuse to heal, instead becoming infected and beginning to glow with a sickly green light in the dark. This was the beginning of phosphorus necrosis, which workers called falsy jaw, a condition that would destroy their faces piece by piece. The phosphorus vapor that filled the factory air was absorbed through the women's lungs and settled in their jawbones. The chemical began eating away at the bone tissue, starting with small areas of decay that quickly spread. The infected bone would literally glow in the dark, giving off an eerie phosphorescent light that could be seen when the women opened their mouths. The smell of rotting bone and phosphorus created a distinctive odor that clung to the affected workers. As the disease progressed, entire sections of jawbone would die and break away, leaving gaping holes in the women's faces. Some lost their lower jaws completely, unable to eat solid food or speak clearly. Others watched as the infection spread upward, destroying their upper jaw, their nose, and the bones around their eyes. The pain was constant and excruciating, described by sufferers as feeling like their faces were being burned from the inside. Mary Bishop worked at Bryant and May for 3 years before the symptoms began. First, her teeth started falling out one by one. Then her lower jaw began to swell and turn black. When she opened her mouth in the dark, her jaw glowed green, like something from a nightmare. The company doctor told her she had bad teeth and poor hygiene, refusing to acknowledge any connection to her work with phosphorus. The women who developed phossy jaw faced a horrible choice. They could have the infected bone surgically removed, which often meant having their entire lower jaw cut away, leaving them permanently disfigured and unable to eat or speak normally. Or they could leave the infected bone in place and risk the infection spreading to their brain, which was usually fatal. Many chose the surgery and spent the rest of their lives unable to eat solid food, communicating through gestures and written notes. Company executives knew about the dangers of white phosphorus, but continued using it because it was cheaper than safer alternatives. Internal documents showed that management was aware of phossy jaw cases as early as the 1870s, yet they continued exposing new workers to the chemical for decades. When workers tried to organize for safer conditions, the company fired them and hired desperate replacements who had no choice but to accept the dangerous work. The match companies could have switched to red phosphorus, which was much safer, but they refused because it cost slightly more and required different manufacturing equipment. They calculated that paying occasional medical bills and legal settlements was cheaper than retooling their factories. Meanwhile, women continued to lose their faces to a disease that was entirely preventable, sacrificing their appearance and their health to produce matches that lit a few seconds faster than safer alternatives. In the overcrowded tenement buildings of New York's Lower East Side, entire families crowded into single rooms that served as both living spaces and garment factories. Women bent over sewing machines from dawn until well past midnight, stitching together the fashionable clothing that filled department store windows uptown. Children as young as 5 sat on the floor, pulling threads and sorting buttons while their mothers raced to complete impossible daily quotas that determined whether the family would eat. The Rosenberg family lived and worked in a 10 by 12-foot room on the 4th floor of a crumbling tenement. Sarah Rosenberg, her 3 daughters, and her elderly mother-in-law shared the space with 6 sewing machines, mountains of fabric, and stacks of partially completed garments. They slept on the floor between the machines, ate their meals while continuing to sew, and rarely saw sunlight. The room had one small window, which they kept closed during winter to prevent the cold from numbing their fingers and slowing their work. The air in these sweatshop apartments was thick with fabric dust, lint, and fibers that workers constantly inhaled. The particles settled in their lungs, causing a condition that doctors called seamstress lung, which led to persistent coughing, difficulty breathing, and eventually consumption. The women coughed constantly, but they couldn't stop working because each day away from the machines meant less money for food and rent. Sarah's workday began at 4 a.m. and ended around 1 a.m., with brief breaks only for meals that consisted of bread and whatever cheap food they could afford. She was paid 3 cents per completed garment, which meant she had to finish at least 50 pieces per day just to earn $1.50. When rush orders came in for popular items, she might work 20 hours straight, her fingers bleeding from needle pricks and her back screaming from hunching over the machine for so long. The youngest Rosenberg daughter, Rebecca, was 7 years old when she started helping with the sewing. Her job was to cut loose threads and sort buttons by size and color, sitting cross-legged on the floor for 12 hours at a time. Her eyes became strained from focusing on small objects in dim light, and her spine curved from sitting hunched over her work. She rarely played with other children because every minute spent away from helping the family meant less money for survival. The working conditions were designed to maximize production while minimizing costs. The tenement rooms had no ventilation systems, no fire safety equipment, and no sanitation facilities other than shared outhouses in the courtyard. During summer, temperatures in the workshops rose above 100 degrees, causing women to faint at their machines. During winter, they worked with numb fingers in unheated rooms, trying to maintain the precision required for delicate stitching while their hands shook from cold. The tuberculosis that spread through these workshops was inevitable. Women worked inches apart from each other, coughing and sneezing in airless rooms, sharing contaminated fabric and breathing the same recirculated air for 18 hours per day. When one worker became ill, the disease spread rapidly through the entire workshop. Families had no choice but to continue working even when sick, because missing even a day of work meant falling behind on quotas that were already almost impossible to meet. The garment manufacturers who contracted this work knew exactly what conditions existed in the tenement sweatshops, but they deliberately looked the other way because the system was profitable. They could produce fashionable clothing at a fraction of the cost of factory-made garments, then sell them in upscale stores to wealthy customers who never imagined the human cost of their bargain purchases. The manufacturers set the piece rates so low that families had no choice but to involve their children in the work, creating a system of legalized child labor that operated in plain sight. Factory inspectors occasionally visited the tenements, but they were easily avoided because the inspectors announced their visits in advance and only worked during normal business hours. The sweatshop families would hide their children, cover their machines, and pretend to be engaged in domestic activities until the inspectors left. The system continued because everyone with the power to stop it benefited financially from maintaining the status quo, while the women and children who suffered had no political voice and no economic alternatives. When the stock market crashed in 1929, hospitals across America faced a crisis that went far beyond economics. As unemployment soared and medical bills became impossible to pay, hospitals found themselves desperately short-staffed while simultaneously overwhelmed with patients who couldn't afford proper care. The solution many institutions adopted was to hire anyone willing to work for minimal wages, regardless of medical training or qualifications. Martha Collins was 19 years old and had never set foot inside a hospital when she answered a classified advertisement for nursing assistants at St. Mary's Hospital in Detroit. The interviewer asked no questions about medical experience or training. He simply confirmed she could read basic instructions, wasn't afraid of blood, and was willing to work 12-hour shifts for 50 cents per day. She started work the following Monday, assigned to a ward of 40 patients recovering from surgery. Her first day involved tasks that would have challenged experienced nurses. She was handed a list of medications and told to distribute pills to patients according to the dosages written on cards attached to their beds. She had no knowledge of what the medications did, what side effects to watch for, or which combinations might be dangerous. When patients asked questions about their treatments, she had no answers. When complications arose, she had no training to recognize the warning signs. The hospital provided no training beyond a brief explanation of where supplies were kept and how to read the patient cards. Martha learned to change surgical dressings by watching other untrained workers, many of whom had learned their techniques from equally unqualified predecessors. She administered injections after being shown the procedure once, with no understanding of proper sterilization, dosage calculations, or injection sites. The first time she gave a patient an injection, her hands shook so badly she had to attempt it 3 times. Within her first week, Martha witnessed preventable deaths caused by medical errors that trained nurses would have caught immediately. A patient died after receiving 10 times the prescribed dose of morphine because she misread the handwritten instructions. Another patient developed a fatal infection after she failed to properly sterilize surgical instruments, not knowing that the quick rinse she gave them was inadequate. A diabetic patient went into shock because she didn't recognize the symptoms of insulin reaction and fed him sugar instead of calling for help. The psychological toll on these untrained workers was devastating. They knew they were unprepared for the life and death responsibilities thrust upon them, but they had no choice except to continue working or face starvation. Martha lay awake at night replaying the day's events, wondering if her mistakes had hurt or killed people who trusted her with their lives. She developed chronic anxiety and recurring nightmares about patients dying under her care. The hospital administration was fully aware that untrained workers were making dangerous mistakes, but they continued the practice because qualified nurses demanded wages the hospital couldn't afford to pay. When families complained about poor care or questioned patient deaths, administrators blamed the inexperience of individual workers rather than acknowledging their own policy of hiring unqualified staff. They fired workers who made obvious mistakes and hired equally untrained replacements the next day. Some of the untrained workers tried desperately to learn proper medical procedures on their own, staying after their shifts to read medical texts and observe experienced doctors when possible. But without formal education in anatomy, pharmacology, or medical theory, they could only memorize procedures without understanding the underlying principles that would help them recognize when something was going wrong. The massive commercial laundries that served hospitals, hotels, and wealthy households across Depression-era America employed thousands of women who handled the most contaminated and dangerous fabrics without any protective equipment. These workers spent their days immersed in clouds of caustic chemicals, boiling water, and toxic fumes while processing linens that carried diseases, bodily fluids, and industrial contaminants that would be considered hazardous waste by modern standards. At the Metropolitan Laundry Company in Chicago, women started their shifts by sorting through enormous piles of soiled linens from local hospitals. Blood-soaked surgical drapes, sheets contaminated with infectious diseases, and bandages crusted with bodily fluids were all handled by bare hands and sorted according to the type of cleaning required. The women had no gloves, no masks, and no knowledge of which items might carry tuberculosis, typhoid, or other deadly diseases. The washing process required workers to prepare chemical baths using lye, chlorine bleach, and carbolic acid in concentrations that could burn through skin in seconds. Women measured these chemicals by pouring them directly from large containers with no measuring tools and no understanding of proper ratios. The chemical fumes filled the air in the laundry rooms, creating an atmosphere so toxic that new workers often vomited or fainted during their first weeks on the job. Helen Kowalski worked in the chemical preparation room, where her job was to mix the strongest cleaning solutions used for hospital linens. She stood over steaming vats of lye and bleach for 10 hours per day, stirring the mixtures with long wooden paddles while toxic vapors rose directly into her face. Within 6 months, the skin on her hands and arms had become permanently discolored and scarred from chemical splashes. Her hair began falling out from constant exposure to the fumes. The washing machines themselves were death traps filled with boiling water and caustic chemicals. Women reached into these machines while they were running to adjust tangled items or add more chemicals, often suffering severe burns when the scalding mixture splashed onto their arms and faces. The machines had no safety guards or automatic shut-off mechanisms, and workers were expected to reach into the dangerous machinery whenever necessary to keep production moving. The most dangerous job in the laundry was operating the chemical rinse stations, where workers used high-pressure hoses to spray linens with concentrated bleach solutions. The spray created a mist of chlorine gas that hung in the air, causing immediate burning in the eyes and throat. Long-term exposure led to permanent lung damage, blindness from chemical burns to the corneas, and skin conditions that left workers covered in painful lesions that never healed. Many women developed what doctors called laundry lung, a condition caused by constantly inhaling fabric dust mixed with chemical particles. The symptoms began with a persistent cough and difficulty breathing, then progressed to chest pain and bloody sputum. The chemical residues in their lungs created permanent scarring that made breathing increasingly difficult until even simple tasks became exhausting. The companies that operated these laundries knew their workers were being poisoned, but they calculated that replacing disabled workers was cheaper than investing in safety equipment or proper ventilation systems. When workers complained about health problems, supervisors told them that industrial work was naturally dangerous and that anyone unwilling to accept the risks could find employment elsewhere. Given the economic climate, there was always a line of desperate women waiting to take jobs that others had abandoned due to illness or injury. The irony was not lost on the women who sacrificed their health to clean other people's contaminated materials. They were destroying their bodies to create the illusion of cleanliness and safety for hospitals and wealthy households, while their own working conditions were more dangerous than the environments they were cleaning. Their work made possible the sanitary conditions that protected others, but they received no protection themselves. Before alarm clocks became affordable for working-class families, industrial cities across America and Britain employed women to wake factory workers for the early morning shifts. These knocker-uppers walked through neighborhoods at 3 and 4 a.m., using long sticks to tap on bedroom windows or rattling pebbles against glass to rouse workers who needed to be at their jobs by sunrise. The work seemed simple and safe, a job perfect for women who needed income but couldn't handle the physical demands of factory labor. Mary O'Brien walked the same route through Pittsburgh's Steel District every morning, carrying a 6-foot bamboo pole to reach second-story windows and a bag of small stones for the higher floors. She was responsible for waking 200 workers spread across a 12-block area, which meant she had to move quickly and efficiently to complete her rounds before the factories opened. Her pay was 15 cents per week per worker, and she needed at least 150 regular customers to earn enough money to pay rent and buy food. The job required her to be alone on dark streets when most criminals were still active and police patrols were sparse. Mary walked through alleys and side streets where drunks slept off their binges and desperate men lurked, looking for easy targets. She carried no weapon and had no protection other than her knowledge of which doorways to avoid and which shortcuts were too dangerous to use even when she was running late. The industrial neighborhoods where factory workers lived were among the most dangerous areas in any city. Unemployment was high, desperation was common, and violence was a regular occurrence. Women, walking alone before dawn, were seen as easy targets for robbery, assault, or worse. Mary learned to move quickly and quietly, avoiding eye contact with strangers and staying in the shadows to make herself less visible to anyone who might be watching. During winter months, the work became even more treacherous. Mary had to navigate icy sidewalks and snow-covered streets in complete darkness, often slipping and falling, while trying to reach windows or climb the makeshift ladders that some workers left out for her convenience. Frostbite on her fingers made it difficult to grip her tools, and the cold made her movements slower and clumsier, increasing both her risk of injury and her vulnerability to attack. The customers themselves sometimes posed dangers that Mary couldn't predict or avoid. Drunk workers might mistake her tapping for a break-in attempt and come outside with weapons. Men who hadn't been paid might blame her for their job troubles and become violent. Workers' wives sometimes accused her of having inappropriate relationships with their husbands, leading to confrontations that could turn physical without warning. Sexual assault was a constant threat that every knocker-upper faced, but never discussed openly. Mary knew of several women who had been attacked while working their routes, but these incidents were rarely reported to police because the women feared losing their jobs or being blamed for putting themselves in dangerous situations. The attacks usually happened in the darkest areas of their routes, where screams couldn't be heard and escape was difficult. The economic reality was that these women had no choice but to accept the dangers because alternative employment was scarce and paid even less. Mary earned about $30 per month for work that required her to risk her safety every single day. But factory jobs for women paid only $20 per month and involved equally dangerous conditions. Domestic work paid even less and often included sexual harassment from employers who knew their servants had no legal protection. When factories closed and unemployment reached 25%, thousands of women discovered that their bodies had become their only valuable asset in an economy that offered them no legitimate way to survive. Women who had worked as secretaries, shop girls, and factory workers found themselves competing for customers outside dance halls and in hotel lobbies, selling sexual services to men who were themselves struggling financially, but still had a few dollars to spend on temporary companionship. The collapse of traditional employment for women created a massive expansion of the sex trade that operated with a new kind of economic desperation. These weren't career prostitutes who had chosen the work, but desperate mothers, abandoned wives, and unemployed young women who saw no other path to survival. They worked without the protection or experience that might have helped them navigate the dangers of selling sex to strangers during the most economically unstable period in American history. The system quickly organized itself into two distinct categories that offered different levels of exploitation and danger. Ringer houses operated as part of organized chains, where women had to register at a central office and undergo regular health examinations to receive a certificate that proved they were disease-free. These women were required to see 10 to 15 customers per day and split their earnings with the house management, but they had some protection from violence and legal trouble. Independent prostitutes worked alone, keeping all their earnings but facing constant danger from both criminals and police. They were arrested more frequently, had no protection from violent customers, and often worked in the most dangerous areas of cities where other businesses had closed due to the economic collapse. Many of these women were mothers trying to feed their children, with no experience in protecting themselves from the violence that was common in street-level sex work. The health certificate system required for Ringer House workers was itself a form of exploitation that put women at risk while appearing to protect them. The examinations were performed by unqualified doctors who charged fees the women could barely afford, and the certificates had to be renewed weekly. Women who showed any signs of disease were fired immediately, often leaving them with no way to earn money while they recovered. The examinations themselves were invasive and humiliating, performed without regard for the women's dignity or comfort. The customers during the Depression were often as desperate as the women serving them, creating volatile situations that could turn violent without warning. Unemployed men used their last dollars for sex, then sometimes became angry or abusive when the transaction was complete. Men who couldn't afford full services negotiated for partial encounters, leading to disputes over payment that sometimes escalated to physical violence. The economic pressure meant women often accepted customers they would have refused in better times, increasing their exposure to dangerous situations. The women who worked as prostitutes during the Depression faced a unique form of social condemnation because their economic desperation was visible and undeniable. Unlike earlier generations of sex workers who could be dismissed as immoral by choice, these women were clearly victims of economic circumstances beyond their control. Yet society's response was often to blame them for their situations, rather than addressing the economic policies that had forced them into sex work. Many women used false names and elaborate disguises to hide their prostitution from family members and former friends, but the small communities of Depression-era America made anonymity nearly impossible. Children discovered their mother's work and faced brutal teasing at school. Wives were abandoned by husbands who couldn't accept their choices, even when those choices were the only thing keeping the family from starvation. The social isolation added another layer of suffering to work that was already physically and emotionally devastating. The long-term consequences for women who survived this period were severe and lasting. Many never recovered economically or socially from their time as prostitutes, finding themselves permanently excluded from respectable employment and marriage prospects. They had sacrificed not just their immediate safety and health, but their future opportunities, trading long-term security for short-term survival during the darkest period of American economic history.